He was terrifying. That's what Scott Steiner said about one man. Just one. In a business full of tough guys, monsters, and legends, only one wrestler made the genetic freak admit something close to fear. But before we get to that name, we need to talk about something weird. The idea that Scott Steiner feared anyone is almost funny, because Scott Steiner didn't fear people. People feared him. He was the guy who made wrestlers nervous. He was the guy who made bosses sweat. He was a walking powder keg with muscles on top of muscles. So when you hear about 10 wrestlers Scott Steiner feared, you have to wonder if that's even real. The truth is more complicated and way more interesting. This video is about separating fact from fiction. It's about finding out who Scott Steiner actually respected and who he just hated, because those are two very different things. Steiner didn't fear his enemies. He went after them. He buried them on live TV. He fought them backstage. But there were a tiny few wrestlers who earned something from Steiner that almost nobody else got. Respect. The kind of respect that borders on fear, the kind that makes you glad you're on someone's good side. So let's break down the real story behind Scott Steiner's feared wrestlers. And let's do it in order from number 10 all the way down to number 1. Before we count down the list, you need to understand who Scott Steiner was, because without that context, none of this makes sense. Scott Steiner wasn't just some wrestler. He was an NCAA All-American. That means he competed against Olympic champions, real athletes, real tough guys. He said himself that after wrestling in college, he wasn't worried about much. That's the foundation. He had real credentials, real toughness, not just the fake wrestling kind. When he got to professional wrestling, Steiner was part of the Steiner brothers tag team with his brother Rick. They were incredible, fast, strong. They did moves nobody else could do. But eventually, Scott went solo. He got bigger, way bigger. His muscles got so huge they didn't look real. He became Big Papa Pump, and that's when things got wild. He started talking trash. He started fighting people for real. He became known for picking backstage fights, for going off script, for saying whatever he wanted on live TV, and nobody could stop him. Why couldn't they stop him? Because Scott Steiner was too valuable. He was too hot. Fans loved the chaos. They loved that he didn't care about the rules. WCW management was scared to fire him. They knew he was their hottest star. Even when he got arrested in 1998 for making threats, they didn't punish him. They let him keep doing whatever he wanted. That created a monster. Not a scared guy, a guy who thought he was untouchable, and mostly he was right. So the idea that this man feared other wrestlers sounds wrong, because the whole story of Scott Steiner is that he was the fear. He was the chaos. He was the guy everyone else had to deal with. But there's a twist. Just because Steiner wasn't afraid of most people doesn't mean he respected nobody. There were a few names, a very few names, that made even the genetic freak admit they were on another level. And that's what this list is really about. Not fear in the traditional sense, but respect so deep it might as well be fear. Now let's talk about where this whole 10 wrestlers thing comes from. Because if you go looking for Scott Steiner actually saying, here are 10 guys I feared, you won't find it. That's not how it happened. What you will find are videos online, lots of videos, with titles like Scott Steiner hated working with these wrestlers, or 10 wrestlers Scott Steiner had beef with. The number 10 shows up a lot, but it's not because Steiner sat down and made a list. It's because YouTube loves lists. 10 is a nice round number. It gets clicks. It sounds official. The truth is that most of these lists are about wrestlers Steiner hated, not feared. Those are completely different things. Steiner hated a lot of people. He hated Hulk Hogan. He hated Ric Flair. He hated Triple H. He had real beef with Diamond Dallas Page. These weren't guys he was scared of. These were guys he wanted to destroy. Guys he thought were liars and cheaters. Guys who used politics to hold him back. That's hate. That's a vendetta, but it's not fear. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Scott Steiner is famous for something called Steiner math. If you've never seen it, look it up. It's one of the most ridiculous promos in wrestling history. Steiner tried to calculate his chances of winning a three-way match. He said he had a 141 2/3% chance of winning. That math makes no sense. It's impossible, but that's the point. Steiner didn't care about facts. He cared about making himself look good and his opponents look stupid. So when you hear a specific number like 10, you have to wonder if that's even real, or if it's just another example of Steiner's loose relationship with numbers. The reality is this: the 10 feared wrestlers narrative is a myth. It's been twisted by clickbait videos and sensational headlines. What's true is that Steiner respected almost nobody. He clashed with almost everybody, and the few people he did respect were special. They were legitimate tough guys, not politicians, not pretty boys. noise, not guys who played the game, but real fighters. The kind of men whose toughness went beyond wrestling, and that's a much shorter list than 10. So let's get into the countdown. But let's be honest about what we're counting down. This isn't a list of guys who scared Steiner. It's a list of guys Steiner had major issues with. Guys he fought, guys he buried, guys he couldn't stand. We'll call this the hated list. And then at the end, we'll get to the real names. The tiny group of wrestlers Steiner actually respected. The ones who belong on the anti-fear list. The ones who were so tough that even Scott Steiner admitted they were different. Number 10, Triple H. Let's start with Triple H. Steiner and Triple H had a famous feud in WWE in 2003. It should have been huge. You had two massive stars, two tough guys, two egos, but it didn't work. The matches were bad, the chemistry wasn't there, and Steiner blamed Triple H. He said Triple H had too much political power. He said Triple H controlled everything backstage. This was during what fans call the Reign of Terror. Triple H was on top. He was married to the boss's daughter. He had all the stroke, and Steiner hated that. He thought Triple H was holding people back, using politics instead of talent. Steiner didn't fear Triple H. He resented him. He saw him as everything wrong with the business, a guy who played the game instead of being the best. Number 9, Ric Flair. Ric Flair is a legend, one of the greatest of all time, but Scott Steiner hated him, and this grudge went way back. In 1991, Steiner and Flair had a match. Steiner was young. He was being built up as a future star, but Steiner believed Flair sabotaged the match. He thought Flair deliberately made him look weak. Why? Because Flair was jealous. Because Flair didn't want a young guy taking his spot. That belief stayed with Steiner for decades. When Steiner became Big Papa Pump, he went after Flair on TV. He cut brutal promos. He called Flair old. He called him a liar. He said Flair was holding back real talent. These weren't scripted lines. These were real feelings. Steiner was using his character to air real grievances, and it worked. Those promos were some of the most intense moments in WCW history. But again, this wasn't fear. This was revenge. This was Steiner punishing someone he thought wronged him. Number 8, Hulk Hogan. If there's one person Scott Steiner hated more than anyone, it's Hulk Hogan. This wasn't just a wrestling rivalry. This was personal. Steiner believed Hogan ruined his career. He believed Hogan used his political power to keep Steiner down. Hogan was the biggest star in wrestling history. He had connections everywhere. He had creative control in his contract. And Steiner thought Hogan used all of that to bury him. The feud lasted years. Even after they both left WCW, Steiner kept talking about Hogan. He said Hogan tried to get him arrested. He said Hogan was a liar and a manipulator. He said Hogan cared more about his spot than the business. And the wild thing is, Steiner wasn't alone. Lots of wrestlers said similar things about Hogan, but Steiner said it louder. He said it on camera. He didn't care who it pissed off. This was a war, not fear, not respect, just pure hate. Number 7, Diamond Dallas. Page Diamond Dallas Page, or DDP, had a violent backstage fight with Scott Steiner in WCW around the year 2000. This wasn't just yelling, this was physical. They actually fought, and it put WCW management in an impossible spot. They didn't know what to do. If they fired Steiner, they'd lose their hottest star. If they fired DDP, they'd anger his friends in the locker room, including Eric Bischoff. So they did nothing. They let it slide. And that tells you everything about how broken WCW was. The company was so dysfunctional that two wrestlers could have a real fight and face no consequences. But why did they fight? Because Steiner and DDP didn't like each other. They had personal issues. They had professional issues. And when you mix Steiner's temper with a chaotic locker room, violence happens. But even here, this wasn't about fear. Steiner wasn't scared of DDP. He went right at him. He fought him. That's not the behavior of a scared man. Number 6 through 4, the others. There are other names that show up in videos about Steiner's enemies. Guys he had issues with, guys he clashed with, but the pattern is always the same. These were political fights. These were personal grudges. These were guys Steiner thought were corrupt or fake or holding him back. He didn't respect them. He didn't fear them. He wanted to expose them. He wanted to beat them. And in a lot of cases, he did. Steiner's whole career was built on going after the establishment, going after the guys with power, the pretty boys, the politicians. He saw himself as the real deal, the guy with real credentials, and everyone else was a phony. That attitude made him enemies, lots of enemies, but it never made him afraid. Asked to 3, the real list, the anti-fear list. Now we get to the truth. The wrestlers Scott Steiner actually respected. This is where the list gets real, because Steiner didn't give respect easily. He had too much pride, too much confidence, but there were a few men who earned it, not through politics, not through promos, but through pure, undeniable toughness. These were men whose reputations went beyond wrestling, men who were known as legitimate tough guys. The kind of guys who could handle themselves in any situation. The kind of guys who made even someone like Scott Steiner think twice. And here's the key. Steiner only respected toughness he couldn't fake. He'd competed against Olympic champions in college. He knew what real toughness looked like. So for him to admit someone was tough, they had to be on another level. They had to be special. And there were only 3 names that fit that description. 3 wrestlers who made Scott Steiner say out loud that they were different, that they were elite, that they were at the top of the food chain. Number 3, Samoan wrestlers. Collectively, Scott Steiner said something very specific about Samoan wrestlers. He said it's hard to find a Samoan that isn't tough. He called them a different breed of cat. And this wasn't just talk. Steiner had wrestled Samoans throughout his career. He'd been in the ring with the Anoa'i family. He'd seen their strength firsthand, and he knew they were built different. There's a long history of Samoan wrestlers being among the toughest in the business. It's cultural, it's genetic, it's part of their heritage. Families like the Anoa'is produced legends: The Rock, Roman Reigns, Yokozuna, Umaga, Rikishi. The list goes on, and Steiner recognized that. He didn't single out one Samoan wrestler. He respected all of them as a group, because to him, being Samoan meant you had that toughness in your blood. You didn't have to prove it. It was just there. And that's a level of respect Steiner didn't give to many people. He respected their genetics, their heritage, their natural strength. This was Steiner, the self-proclaimed genetic freak, acknowledging another group of genetic freaks. That means something. Number 2, the Barbarian. The Barbarian was a beast, a massive power wrestler who looked like he walked out of a nightmare. And Scott Steiner named him specifically as one of the toughest men he ever met. Steiner didn't just say the Barbarian was strong. He said he was legit tough. That's a big difference. Lots of wrestlers are strong. They lift weights, they look good. But legit tough means something else. It means you can fight for real. It means you're not just playing a character. You are the character. The Barbarian had that reputation. He wasn't a guy you wanted to mess with. He wasn't political. He wasn't playing games. He was just a legit hard man. And Steiner put him right next to Haku as being at the top of the food chain. That's elite company. That's the highest praise Steiner ever gave. So why doesn't the Barbarian get talked about more? Because he wasn't a main event guy. He wasn't a star. But in the locker room, where it really mattered, everyone knew. The Barbarian was not to be messed with. And Scott Steiner, of all people, was glad he never had to find out what would happen if they weren't friends. Number 1, Haku Meng. And here we are, number 1, the man Scott Steiner truly feared, or at least the closest thing to fear that Scott Steiner ever felt. Haku, also known as Meng. If you know anything about wrestling history, you know this name. Haku is a legend, not for his matches, not for his championships, but for his reputation as the toughest human being in the history of professional wrestling. There are stories about Haku that sound impossible. Stories about him fighting multiple men at once and winning. Stories about him biting people's noses off. Stories about him being so tough that even the biggest, scariest wrestlers in the business were terrified of him. And those stories aren't exaggerated. They're real. Scott Steiner said Haku was at the top of the food chain. He said Haku was legit strong and legit tough. And then Steiner said something very revealing. He said he was glad he was friends with Haku. Think about that. Scott Steiner, the man who feared nobody, was glad he didn't have to fight Haku. That's not just respect, that's acknowledgement. That's Steiner admitting in his own way that Haku was on a different level, that Haku was someone you didn't want as an enemy. Why was Haku so feared? Because his toughness wasn't an act, it was cultural. Haku is Tongan. He comes from a warrior culture, a culture where strength and toughness are everything. He brought that into wrestling, and everyone knew it. Wrestlers who were tough guys themselves would tell stories about Haku. They'd say they'd never seen anyone like him. They'd say he was the one guy you absolutely did not want to anger. And this reputation followed Haku his entire career. From the WWF to WCW to everywhere he went, the message was the same. Don't mess with Haku. Scott Steiner understood this. He recognized real toughness when he saw it. And with Haku, he saw something he couldn't match. Something beyond muscles, beyond college wrestling credentials, beyond even his own genetic freak status. Haku was in a category by himself, and Steiner was smart enough to stay on his good side. That's why Haku is number 1. Not because Steiner said he feared him directly, but because Steiner's respect for Haku was so deep, so genuine, that it revealed a truth. Even the genetic freak knew there was one man you just didn't cross, and that man was Haku. So what does all this tell us about wrestling? About the locker room? About the culture that created Scott Steiner? It tells us that professional wrestling has always had two worlds. The world you see on TV and the world backstage. On TV, everything is scripted. The good guys win, the bad guys lose, the stories are planned. But backstage, it's different. Backstage, there are real hierarchies, real politics, real fights. And the men who succeed backstage aren't always the same ones who succeed on TV. Scott Steiner was a product of this culture. He came up in an era where toughness mattered, where you had to be able to handle yourself, where if someone disrespected you, you didn't go to management. You handled it yourself. That's why Steiner got into so many fights. That's why he was so volatile, because that's what the locker room demanded. You had to be tough. You had to be willing to fight. Otherwise, you'd get eaten alive. But even in that world, there were levels. Most wrestlers were tough enough to survive. They could hold their own, but there were a few who were on another level. Guys like Haku, guys like the Barbarian. These weren't just wrestlers. They were legitimate hard men. Men whose reputations went beyond the wrestling business. And in a locker room full of tough guys, these men stood out. They were the guys everyone respected. The guys nobody wanted to fight. The guys who set the standard. Scott Steiner recognized this. He knew that no matter how tough he was, there would always be someone tougher, someone more dangerous. And instead of pretending otherwise, he acknowledged it. He gave credit where credit was due. He said Haku and the Barbarian were at the top of the food chain. And that honesty is part of what made Steiner so compelling. He wasn't fake. He wasn't playing a character all the time. When he respected someone, he said it. And when he hated someone, he said that too. There was no filter, no corporate speak, just raw truth. But there's another side to this story, the side that shows what happens when management loses control. Because Scott Steiner's career is also a story about institutional failure, about what happens when a company is so desperate, so chaotic, that they let one man run wild. WCW in its final years was a disaster. Everyone knows this. The company was bleeding money. The locker room was toxic. Egos were out of control, and management had no idea what to do. Scott Steiner thrived in that chaos. He became the hottest star in the company by doing whatever he wanted. He picked fights, he went off script, he buried people on live TV, and WCW couldn't stop him. Why? Because they needed him. They were terrified that if they fired Steiner, they'd lose their last big star. So they let him get away with everything. They let him fight DDP, they let him bury Flair and Hogan, they let him be a walking powder keg. And in doing so, they created a monster. This wasn't just about Steiner being tough. This was about a company that had lost all authority. A company where the only thing that mattered was short-term ratings. Long-term stability didn't matter. Locker room peace didn't matter. All that mattered was keeping Steiner happy because he was moving the needle. And that's a dangerous game, because once you give one person that much power, everyone else sees it. Everyone else knows that if you're valuable enough, you can do whatever you want, and that destroys any sense of order. Scott Steiner's story is a cautionary tale. It shows what happens when management is weak, when there are no consequences, when chaos is rewarded instead of punished. In a healthy wrestling company, Steiner would have been fined, suspended, or fired for his behavior. But WCW wasn't healthy. It was dying. And in its death throes, it elevated the most chaotic, most uncontrollable performer it had. That's not a success story. That's a failure. A failure of leadership, a failure of structure, a failure of everything that makes a wrestling company work. One of the most important parts of Scott Steiner's legacy is the shoot promo. If you don't know what that means, a shoot promo is when a wrestler breaks character and talks about real backstage issues. They expose the business. They blur the line between fiction and reality. And Scott Steiner was a master of it. When he became Big Papa Pump, he didn't just cut regular wrestling promos. He went after people for real. He talked about real grudges, real politics, real backstage manipulation, and that made him incredibly compelling. Think about his promos against Ric Flair. He didn't just say Flair was a bad wrestler. He said Flair sabotaged him in 1991. He said Flair was a jealous old man who held young talent back. He said Flair was a liar and a cheat. Those weren't scripted insults. Those were real accusations. And fans knew it. They could tell the difference between a worked promo and a shoot promo. And when Steiner was shooting, everyone paid attention. The same thing happened with Hulk Hogan. Steiner didn't just say Hogan was past his prime. He said Hogan used his political power to destroy careers. He said Hogan only cared about staying on top. He said Hogan was everything wrong with the business. And again, fans knew this was real. They knew Steiner wasn't reading from a script. He was speaking from the heart. He was using his TV time to wage real wars against real enemies. And that was revolutionary, but it was also dangerous. Because once you start shooting, you can't stop. Once you blur the line between real and fake, everything becomes real. And that's hard to control, that's hard to manage. Steiner's shoot promos made him a star, but they also made him a liability. Because you never knew what he was going to say. You never knew who he was going to bury. And in a business built on cooperation and trust, that's a problem. But Steiner didn't care. He valued honesty over politics. He valued saying what everyone else was thinking, but was too scared to say. And that attitude defined his entire career. So let's get back to the original question. Who did Scott Steiner fear? And the answer is complicated. Because fear and hate are not the same thing. Steiner hated a lot of people. Hogan, Flair, Triple H, DDP. These were men he wanted to destroy. Men he thought were corrupt or fake or holding him back. But hate doesn't mean fear. Hate means you want to fight someone. Fear means you want to avoid them. And Steiner never avoided anyone. He went right at his enemies. He confronted them. He fought them. That's not fear. That's aggression. But when it came to guys like Haku and the Barbarian, it was different. Steiner didn't hate them. He respected them. And that respect came from a place of recognition. Steiner recognized that these men were on a level he couldn't reach. Not because he was weak, but because they were that strong. They were that tough. They were in a category by themselves. And Steiner was smart enough to acknowledge it. He didn't try to fight them. He didn't try to prove he was tougher. He just said, yeah, those guys are at the top of the food chain. I'm glad we're friends. And that's the closest thing to fear you'll ever get from Scott Steiner. So the list of 10 feared wrestlers is a myth. It's a creation of the internet, a product of clickbait videos and sensational headlines. The real story is much simpler. Scott Steiner respected 3 names: Haku, the Barbarian, and Samoan wrestlers as a whole. Everyone else he either hated, fought, or didn't care about. That's the truth. That's the reality. And it's way more interesting than some made-up list of 10 names. So what's Scott Steiner's legacy? What should we remember him for? Is he a hero, a villain, a cautionary tale? The answer is all of the above. Scott Steiner was one of the most talented wrestlers of his generation. His work in the Steiner Brothers tag team was revolutionary. His transformation into Big Papa Pump was iconic. His promos were legendary, but he was also volatile, dangerous, hard to control. He made enemies everywhere he went. He burned bridges, he fought people, he said things that couldn't be taken back. But through it all, Steiner was honest. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He didn't play the political game. He didn't kiss up to management. He was who he was. And if you didn't like it, too bad. That authenticity made him a star. It made him compelling. It made him someone fans couldn't look away from. Even when he was wrong, even when he went too far, people watched because they knew it was real. They knew Steiner wasn't acting. He was just being himself. And in a business built on fakery, that's rare. Steiner's career also shows the importance of legitimate credentials. He wasn't just a bodybuilder who learned to wrestle. He was an NCAA All-American who became a bodybuilder. That background gave him confidence. It gave him credibility. It meant he could back up everything he said. And that's why he was able to challenge the establishment. Why he was able to call out Hogan and Flair in Triple H, because he had the credentials to say, I'm as good as you, maybe better. And nobody could really argue. But his career also shows the limits of chaos. Yes, Steiner was entertaining. Yes, he was compelling. But he also burned out. His body broke down. His relationships deteriorated. His opportunities dried up. By the end of his career, he was a shell of what he once was. Not because he lost his talent, but because the chaos that made him a star also destroyed him. He couldn't sustain it. Nobody could. Chaos is exciting in the short term, but it's exhausting in the long term. And Steiner paid the price. So let's wrap this up. Scott Steiner didn't fear 10 wrestlers. He didn't fear 5 wrestlers. He barely feared anyone because Scott Steiner was the fear. He was the guy other people worried about. He was the walking powder keg, the genetic freak, the man who said whatever he wanted and fought whoever challenged him. But even Scott Steiner had limits. Even he recognized that there were a few men in wrestling who were on another level. Men whose toughness went beyond the business. Men who were legitimate hard men, and he named them. Haku, the Barbarian, the Samoan wrestlers. That's the list. That's the truth. Everyone else he just hated. Hogan, Flair, Triple H, DDP. These were political enemies, personal grudges. Men he wanted to destroy, but not men he feared. Never men he feared, because to Scott Steiner, fear wasn't part of his vocabulary. He didn't back down. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He confronted. He fought. He exposed. And that attitude defined his entire career. The myth of the 10 feared wrestlers is just that, a myth, a product of the internet age, a sensational headline designed to get clicks. But the real story is better. The real story is about a man who respected almost nobody, who challenged everyone, who burned every bridge, and who, in doing so, became one of the most unforgettable characters in wrestling history. Scott Steiner wasn't afraid. He was dangerous. And the only men who earned his respect were the ones who were even more dangerous than he was. And when the genetic freak says he's glad he never had to fight you, you know you're built different. That's the real list. That's the real legacy. Haku at number 1, the Barbarian at number 2, the Samoans at number 3, and everyone else doesn't matter. Because in Scott Steiner's world, you were either legitimately tough or you were just another politician he was going to bury. And that's how the genetic freak saw the world. Simple, brutal, honest. That was Scott Steiner. And that's why we're still talking about him today.